Women are so predictable, he laughed, and that's when I decided he'd regret ever underestimating me. That's the sentence that burned into my mind that night, the night they publicly humiliated me in front of the entire company. I remember the golden light from the chandeliers shimmering over the crowd, the clink of champagne glasses, the holiday playlist humming in the background. Everyone was laughing, celebrating another record-breaking year for Centurion Systems, the tech firm I'd given 5 years of my life to. Before diving into the story, comment where you're watching from and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the latest stories. 5 years of working late, skipping birthdays, pulling entire nights on client deliverables, all for the promise of one thing, a promotion. And that night I got one. Just not the kind I expected. When the COO, Michael Trent, tapped his glass with a spoon, the chatter faded. He flashed that politician smile of his, the kind that says I control the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "let's give a big round of applause for our head of strategy, Amelia Brooks." My heart raced. It was finally happening. I stood, brushing my dress nervously, trying to look calm even as the applause rippled through the crowd. Then came the punchline. Michael grinned wider. Or should I say, former head of strategy. Laughter exploded. My stomach dropped. He continued, pretending it was all light-hearted fun. Due to some restructuring and perhaps a few strategic miscalculations, Amelia will be stepping down to a consulting role. But don't worry, he winked. She'll still be around to advise the new department head. Let's give her a hand for all her hard work. There it was. Public. Mocking. Deliberate. They demoted me at the holiday party. My throat went dry, but I forced a smile, clapped with everyone else, and excused myself to the restroom. I didn't cry. Not yet. I just stared at my reflection, mascara perfect, lipstick flawless, and thought, they really think I'll take this lying down. That night, after the speeches ended and people returned to gossip and drinks, I returned to my table and found the demotion papers waiting in an envelope. No HR, no conversation, just a signature line. So I signed, but not before taking a photo of it with my phone. And then, as I tucked the papers into my purse, I had an idea. Something dangerous. Something brilliant. You see, I knew things about Centurion Systems, about Michael Trent in particular, that would make a board of directors sit up straight. And I wasn't the kind of woman who played victim. I built strategies for a living. I'd just never written one this personal. I spent the next few weeks smiling at meetings, advising the new head of strategy, while behind the scenes, I began assembling my revenge, quietly, precisely, the way Michael had taught me to destroy competition. By mid-January, I'd gathered every email, every contract, every discrepancy I could find between Centurion's internal deals and the ones they reported to investors. And then came the piece de resistance, a file marked MSA, Vendor 113B. The master service agreement that Michael had personally approved 6 months ago. It was worth $8.4 million. It had his digital signature on it. And it was illegal as hell. He'd signed off on a shell contract with a fake vendor that funneled funds through a network of subsidiaries, a move that could expose the company to corporate fraud charges. I remember sitting in my apartment, the city lights blinking through the window, whispering to myself, "You wanted predictable, Michael? Fine. Predict this." But revenge isn't about chaos. It's about timing. So I waited. The opportunity came in the form of a company lawyer, Jonathan Hale. A man known for discretion, a man Michael trusted implicitly. And so, at the next corporate event, ironically another party, I brought a small, beautifully wrapped box. Inside it was a single document, printed and sealed. The label read, "A holiday gift for the man who knows where all the bodies are buried." Jonathan chuckled when I handed it to him. He opened the box, slid out the document, and scanned the first line. Then he froze. His breathing hitched. And he looked at me, pale. "Tell me this isn't your signature on the Centurion MSA," I said softly. He blinked. "Where did you get this?" I just smiled. "Let's just say I've been consulting." That was the moment everything began to unravel. Not just for Michael, but for everyone who thought Amelia Brooks was a predictable woman. Because I was about to make the COO personally liable for everything he'd tried to bury. After that night with Jonathan, the plan moved from idea to machine. Revenge isn't a tantrum, it's an operation. I told myself that every step had to be rational, unemotional, surgical. If I let anger drive me, I'd make mistakes. So I leaned on the same skills that had propelled me through Centurion's climb: project management, risk modeling, and a ruthless attention to detail. First, I mapped the people. Not just names and titles, but leverage points. Who had access to what, who wanted what, and who could be nudged without breaking. HR was brittle and terrified of bad press. The legal team loved quiet settlements. The board was a mosaic of investors who cared more about audits than reputations, perfect targets. Then there was Michael's inner circle, sycophants who would defend him publicly but fold at the first credible legal threat. I made a list and folded it into my purse like prayer notes. Next, evidence. I had the MSA. That one document thrilled me like a loaded gun. But it wasn't enough to topple a COO. Corporations cover themselves with layers: plausible deniability, plausible contracts, plausible signatures. So I collected corroboration, email chains, Slack messages, time-stamped calendar invites, spreadsheets with odd ledger entries. Every piece had to connect like a forensic map back to the MSA and to Michael. I methodically cross-referenced signatures, server logs, and approval histories. Where logs were missing or scrubbed, I noted the holes. Omissions are often the loudest evidence. I also needed allies, carefully chosen, invisible allies. Jonathan, the lawyer, was the beginning. After he read the document in the box and went pale, he became a potential conduit. I needed him to react, but not in panic. Panic invites protective behavior. So I leaned into subtlety. I invited him for coffee under the guise of legal housekeeping and listened. People talk when they think they're alone. Their anxiety makes them spill. Jonathan admitted he had suspicions: irregular payments, a vendor that didn't answer detailed queries, a senior exec with too much unilateral sign-off power. He was terrified because his job depended on the company's stability. I whispered, very carefully, that stability was overrated when it protects criminals. His eyes flickered. He wasn't ready to be my ally yet, but he was vulnerable to the idea of a quieter, safer exit if the truth came out. While Jonathan wavered, I began to plant small, credible seeds for the board. I didn't want to scream fraud across the intercom. I wanted to whisper doubt into ears that had money to lose. I composed an innocuous-looking memo, data-heavy, dry, and perfectly inoffensive, about compliance concerns in Q4. It read like an internal audit note, nothing scandalous, but it highlighted discrepancies only someone inside would notice. I sent it anonymously to 2 independent auditors who worked with Centurion. I used burnt email addresses and a VPN. This was not amateur hour. The auditors, whose livelihoods hinged on sniffing out bad numbers, responded with requests for documents. They smelled the faintest scent of rot. Michael, oblivious to the storm brewing, kept performing. He posted smiling photos on LinkedIn, attended investor lunches, and told triumphant war stories at leadership meetings. That smugness was poisonous fuel. He assumed the demotion was a joke that would fade. He was wrong. Pride makes executives sloppy. It makes them reuse phrases, sign the same forms, and forward the same attachments without thinking. I watched his patterns. I found emails where he forwarded sensitive docs to personal accounts during travel. I found timestamps that didn't match business hours. I found a trail of approvals that looped around a single person, him. I also protected myself. You'd be amazed how quickly allies become enemies when money is at stake. I set up encrypted backups of every file in 3 separate cloud locations, using accounts that could not be traced back to my work email. I created a dead man switch, an automated release scheduled to send key documents to the auditors and a select journalist if I disappeared or if a certain email did not trigger acknowledgement within a prescribed window. It felt dramatic, because it was. But corporate fights can escalate to dismissals, legal silencing, or worse. I wanted insurance. Then came the human chess. I started small acts of social sabotage against Michael's credibility without drawing attention to myself. I asked casual, pointed questions in meetings about vendor vetting processes, Notes that would make anyone with dirty deals uneasy. I complimented Michael on his risk appetite in front of the compliance team, just loud enough for them to start asking questions privately. I quietly befriended a junior analyst who had found anomalies in a ledger months earlier and who had been brushed off. I told them, "If you want someone to listen, bring it to me." They did, and now more patterns appeared. At the same time, I fed material to the independent auditors in a way designed to look like routine checks escalating. Because once an auditor smells irregularities, the machine of corporate governance whirs into life, and that's what I wanted. An independent engine probing the rot Michael had buried. Auditors started to request deeper documentation. The legal team, including Jonathan, scrambled to produce records. They produced what they could. What they couldn't they explained away as archival issues or vendor transitions. Their language betrayed stress. I measured the hesitation, cataloged the excuses. Pressure builds silently. It is a pressure that makes people act rashly. And when people act rashly, they leave fingerprints. Michael began to backtrack on public statements, sending clarifying memos that were oddly defensive. He asked legal to approve retroactive sign-offs. He sent angry texts at 2 a.m. about people who don't understand the business. His circle grew tight, suspicious, and noisy. The more noise, the more opportunity one had to place the silence-revealing document in front of the right person at the right time. By February, the auditors had scheduled preliminary interviews. The board requested a compliance briefing. I kept my face smooth throughout, helpful, calm, the retired leader who simply wanted to help the new person settle into a role. No one suspected the smiling consultant at the table was the one pulling threads in the background. I wasn't reckless. I was meticulous. I had built a dam of evidence, and all I needed was one credible breach to let the river flow. The MSA was that breach, and I had arranged for it to arrive precisely where it could not be dismissed, into the hands of people who made decisions based on audits and legal exposure. The night before the auditors' interviews, I sat on my couch and thought about what revenge had become. It wasn't the burning of a bridge for the thrill of it. It was the deliberate dismantling of a man's shield, piece by piece, until he was accountable. That's when I realized the true poetry of corporate retribution. Not the spectacle, but the inevitability. And I would enjoy watching the collapse. When the auditors arrived, the office felt like a courtroom long before any gavel. People walked with a new stiffness, smiles tighter, conversations shorter. Michael tried to hold the room with his usual charm, but his voice had an edge. It betrayed someone who knows the house of cards is wobbling. I sat across from him at the compliance briefing, deliberately neutral, hands folded, watching. This was the part where the fight stopped being secret and became procedural, and procedures favor the prepared. The auditors started with innocuous questions: vendor onboarding processes, approval hierarchies, contract retention policies. Those were the soft ends that could be tied back to the MSA. As their inquiries tightened, the legal team grew defensive. Jonathan spoke in calibrated sentences, the kind that admit nothing while appearing cooperative. I watched him flinch at a few pointed queries. He was no longer just a scared man who might help me escape. He was someone cornered between loyalty and law. Then the auditors asked for the Centurion MSA for vendor 113B. For a second, the room held its collective breath. Someone in legal excused themselves and returned with a copy. Michael watched as the auditor flipped through it. The signature was clear: Michael Trent's encrypted digital signature, logged at 2:13 a.m. on a weekend, attached to a clause that diverted payment authorization outside regular channels. That clause wasn't a clerical error, it was deliberate. You could feel the shift. The auditor's polite questions turned blunt. They asked for corroborating bank statements, for communications about the vendor, for proof of services rendered. That's when the tactics changed. Michael's leadership team went into triage mode. PR drafted careful statements about legacy vendor relationships, compliance created retroactive memos explaining procedures, and HR prepared for internal fallout. But the most dangerous move was the one Michael made privately. He called me into his office. I thought it would be a scene, accusations, gaslighting, an attempt to intimidate me into silence. Instead, he used a different lever: fear and bribery disguised as pragmatism. He told me quietly that the company could make this go away if I signed a confidentiality agreement and agreed to a severance package with strict terms. "We can make sure your future is secure, Amelia," he said. "You don't want to be known as the one who brought the whole company down." He smiled as if offering charity. I recorded the conversation. Not because I needed another piece of evidence, but because I wanted to remember the precise tone of his arrogance. Then I said something he didn't expect. "I don't want anything for myself," I told him. "I want accountability." His face twitched. He accused me of being vengeful, jealous, irrational. He warned that a public fight would damage my reputation, that investors hate drama. It was a warning, thinly veiled as advice. Within 48 hours, the pressure tactics multiplied. Anonymous complaints appeared in HR files, allegations that I had been unprofessional, that I had leaked confidential documents. A smear started to slither through Slack channels and whispered lunches. Someone doctored a photo of me at a client event to imply misconduct. My LinkedIn inbox swelled with passive-aggressive notes from concerned colleagues. It was classic, discredit the messenger. I could have folded. Many people do. They take the money, sign the non-disclosure, and move on with a new resume. But this wasn't about money. It was about a line he'd crossed, and the people who would be left to clean up the legal mess if he walked away unscathed. So I fought back in ways Michael didn't anticipate. First, I accelerated the dead man switch. Every document I'd cataloged, bank reconciliations, email threads, timestamps, was uploaded to 3 independent repositories. An automated system would send the full batch to the auditors and a carefully vetted investigative journalist if I received any attempt at coercion or if specific triggers were not acknowledged. I changed the triggers to be more sensitive. I added redundancy. I added a personal note inside the package to the journalist. Simple, factual, and impossible to dismiss as rumor. Then I began a surgical counteroffensive in parallel. I shared a private, verifiable dataset with an audit partner I trusted, someone outside the company's usual network. The dataset included a ledger reconciliation that directly contradicted Michael's narratives. I didn't leak the MSA itself to the public yet. Instead, I handed the auditors a breadcrumb trail they couldn't ignore. Their follow-up requests pivoted from theory to proof. Once the auditors found corroborating wire transfers and phone records that matched my timeline, the question wasn't whether there was a problem, it was how deep it went. Michael panicked. Panic is ugly on men like him. It reveals strategies that look competent in the boardroom but crumble under scrutiny. He started issuing last-minute directives, retroactive approvals stamped with convoluted justifications, emergency meetings called at dawn to present newly discovered paperwork. He demanded meetings with the auditors. He tried to assert control over the legal narrative by instructing lawyers to frame irregularities as administrative discrepancies. Jonathan followed orders with visible reluctance. Then Michael made a fatal error. He reached out to the journalist I'd contacted directly, an obvious move to intimidate and gather counterintelligence. He posed as a concerned source about potential misinformation. The journalist, ethically bound and professional, followed the trail to my package. They found the breadcrumb ledger, the metadata, the signature inconsistencies. The journalist reached out to me with a single question: "Can you prove this is deliberate?" I responded with the recorded conversation and a small selection of emails that showed Michael's pattern of forwarding vendor invoices to personal accounts. That was enough. The journalist scheduled a confidential briefing and told me they were preparing an investigative piece contingent on legal confirmation. That's when the board stepped in. Board members, who until then were mostly abstract voices on quarterly calls, began asking harrowing questions. They demanded immediate, full transparency from Michael. He tried to buy time, but the auditors presented preliminary findings that suggested not just poor judgment, but potential criminal exposure. The severity of the allegations turned opinion into obligation. The board formed a special committee. Legal counsel recommended that Centurion disclose the issue to investors and regulators. For the first time since I'd joined, Centurion's top brass was reacting to me, not trying to control me. In retaliation, Michael launched an aggressive legal response, filing a motion to assert executive privilege and to freeze certain documents. He aimed to bury the MSA under protective orders and make my life miserable with subpoenas and countersuits. It was a classic move. Overwhelm with paperwork until the whistleblower caves. I anticipated it. The preparatory work I'd done, burn-proof copies, encrypted timestamps, outside forensic validation, meant his legal landmines were less effective. The conflict had become a public, procedural war. Friends texted cautionary notes. Mentors offered advice. My phone rang constantly with both threats and support. I slept in 2-hour bursts, always half listening for the sound of my inbox exploding with subpoenas. I was tired, but the fatigue sharpened my focus. Michael had gambled that humiliation would break me. What he didn't factor in was that accountability can be a more powerful motivator than fear. And I had momentum. The day the story broke, it wasn't a slow leak. It was a detonation. The headline hit at 6:43 a.m. Centurion COO under investigation for contract fraud and misappropriation of funds. My phone started buzzing before I even poured my coffee. Notifications flooded in. Unread messages, missed calls, alerts from investor boards. I opened the article. It was all there, the timeline, the shell vendor, the digital signatures, the redirection of funds. The journalist hadn't mentioned my name, but the description of an internal compliance source who had triggered the audit told everyone exactly where the story began. By 8 a.m., the company's internal Slack channels had gone nuclear. Screenshots of the articles circled like wildfire. Employees speculated openly about which executive was next. By 8:30, the auditor's confidential report leaked to the press, confirming discrepancies in multiple vendor payments. And by 9 o'clock, Centurion stock had dropped 12%. Michael called an emergency meeting. I watched him on the live company feed, tie slightly crooked, smile frozen in that strained, "this is fine" expression. He insisted the issue was an unfortunate misunderstanding and that Centurion's leadership was cooperating fully. But his eyes gave him away. You could see the panic flicker beneath the performance. His voice shook when he said, "We take integrity seriously." When the feed ended, my phone rang. It was Jonathan. "Amelia," he said quietly. "They're turning on him. The board's meeting early. They've seen everything." I could hear it in his voice, the shock of realization, the relief of no longer carrying someone else's sins. "I didn't want it to come to this," I said. And I meant it. Revenge hadn't started as destruction. It started as justice. But justice, in the corporate world, always looks like bloodshed. By noon, regulators had arrived at Centurion's headquarters. Investigators in dark suits and government badges swept through the glass doors while employees whispered behind their monitors. Someone snapped a photo. It hit Twitter in minutes. The caption read, "Centurion Systems raided amid fraud probe." The dominoes fell faster than I expected. Emails were frozen, accounts locked, executives pulled from meetings. The legal department scrambled to contain leaks. Meanwhile, Michael's PR team tried to spin the narrative. Baseless claims, misinterpretations, confidential paperwork taken out of context. But the damage was already metastasizing. Because I had left one final breadcrumb. Remember that photo I'd taken of my demotion papers at the holiday party? The one with the timestamp and the company's logo glittering under chandelier light? It was proof that they'd made a personnel decision without process, in a public setting, while knowing about financial irregularities. That photo, attached to the internal whistleblower file, established retaliation. And retaliation meant personal liability for Michael, for HR, for the executives who signed off on it. That's what broke him. By evening, the board had suspended him, pending investigation. By morning, he was escorted out of the building. And the best part? He didn't even see it coming. But revenge isn't over when they fall. It's over when they realize why they fell. 2 days later, I was summoned by the Special Committee's counsel to provide a statement. The meeting took place in a neutral office, gray walls, stainless steel coffee pot, anonymous conference table. 3 lawyers sat across from me, notebooks open. Jonathan was there too, looking exhausted but lighter somehow. They asked me to recount the sequence, The holiday party, the demotion, the MSA discovery, the chain of communications. I answered factually, without embellishment. I gave them every file, every timestamp, every cross-check. When they finished, one of the lawyers leaned forward. "Miss Brooks," she said, "you realize what you've done here has legal implications beyond Centurion. You've exposed not just misconduct, but a pattern of liability." I nodded. That was the point. They exchanged glances, the kind people make when the truth is heavier than they expected. That night, I walked through downtown alone. The air was sharp with winter. Skyscraper windows flickered like cold stars. I should have felt triumphant. Instead, I felt quiet. The revenge had worked. The man who'd mocked me publicly was now the headline of his own undoing. His arrogance, his manipulation, his dismissal of women like me, it had all come full circle. But victory has an aftertaste. Because even as I stood there under the city lights, I knew there would be collateral damage. Employees who'd lose bonuses, clients who'd question contracts, investors who'd panic. My actions had been precise, but precision doesn't always protect the innocent. I went home, opened my laptop, and wrote a letter to the board. Not to justify myself, but to explain why I'd done it. I told them that corruption doesn't begin with fraud. It begins with disrespect. The moment you humiliate someone publicly, the moment you think ethics are optional, that's where the downfall starts. I reminded them that companies don't collapse because of bad luck. They collapse because good people get tired of being silent. The next morning, my inbox lit up with a message from an unknown address. It was from Michael. The subject line: "You won." The body of the email read only 6 words. "I underestimated you. That was my mistake.
No apology. No denial. Just that."
I stared at it for a long time. Then I archived it, closed my laptop, and exhaled. He was right. He'd underestimated me. But more importantly, he'd underestimated what happens when someone finally refuses to play by the rules of men like him. A month after Michael's removal, Centurion Systems no longer felt like the empire it once was. The glossy offices were half empty, the company logo on the glass doors replaced with a temporary decal that read under reorganization. Employees moved like ghosts through hallways that used to echo with ambition. The silence was the sound of reckoning. I should have felt satisfied. For weeks, people had sent me messages, some grateful, others curious. "You're brave," one said. "You destroyed him," another whispered like it was a compliment. But revenge isn't as glamorous as people think. It's cold, procedural, and exhausting. It takes something from you, even when you win. The investigation that followed exposed more than anyone expected. Michael's MSA deal had been one piece of a larger web of misappropriation that implicated several senior managers. They'd all been feeding from the same trough, hiding behind paperwork and bureaucracy. My evidence gave regulators the foothold they needed to dig deeper, and they did. Centurion stock crashed another 20% before stabilizing under interim leadership. The board issued a public apology. I watched the broadcast from my living room, sitting cross-legged on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, coffee growing cold beside me. They never said my name, but everyone who mattered knew, and that anonymity suited me fine. The government eventually filed charges. Michael was indicted for corporate fraud and falsifying records. The lawyer, Jonathan, cooperated fully and avoided prosecution. I testified in the preliminary hearings, calm, factual, detached. When Michael entered the courtroom for the first time, I felt an odd mix of sadness and vindication. He looked smaller than I remembered, like the weight of his arrogance had finally peeled off, leaving only the man underneath. Our eyes met once. He didn't smirk this time. He just nodded faintly, as if acknowledging a shared truth. We both knew exactly how this story had begun and how it had to end. Afterward, as cameras flashed outside the courthouse, I walked straight past the reporters. No comment.
No interviews.
This wasn't a headline for me, it was closure. Back home, life began to reshape itself. I took time off, traveled, and started sleeping again. The anxiety that had kept me awake for months slowly faded, replaced by something calmer. Purpose. In quiet moments, I replayed that night at the holiday party. The laughter, the champagne, the humiliation. The moment that had started it all. If they had simply treated me with respect, none of this would have happened. But they didn't. And that's the irony of power. People lose it not because others take it away, but because they forget it's borrowed. I started journaling my experience, not as a memoir, but as an autopsy of silence. How corporate cultures breed complicity, how women get labeled emotional for demanding fairness, how loyalty becomes a leash. Words poured out faster than I could type. I didn't realize it yet, but I was writing the foundation of something new. A few months later, a small publishing house approached me through a mutual contact at the audit firm. They wanted to know if I'd consider writing a book, fictionalized, anonymous, about corporate revenge and whistleblowing. I said yes, partly because it felt poetic, and partly because it was time to reclaim the narrative on my own terms. That's how the liability clause was born. It wasn't just a story about betrayal. It was a guide for every underdog who'd been told to be professional while being trampled. It became an unexpected bestseller in niche circles, corporate professionals, lawyers, ethics students. Emails poured in from women and men alike, people who'd faced similar humiliations, who'd wanted justice, but didn't know how to fight for it. And for the first time, my revenge stopped being about one man. It became about systems, about voices, about people learning to fight smarter. A year later, I returned to Centurion's building, not as an employee, but as a guest speaker. The new leadership had rebranded the company, rebuilt its culture, and wanted me to speak about integrity and accountability in leadership. I almost said no.
But then I thought of the symbolism.
The same glass atrium where I'd once been laughed at was now filled with a younger generation of employees who looked at me with respect instead of mockery. I walked to the podium. My voice didn't shake. I once stood in this room. I began, and learned the hard way that silence protects the wrong people. But silence can also be broken, with evidence, with courage, and with time. You don't need to be fearless to do what's right. You just need to be done being afraid. The room fell quiet. No applause, no murmurs, just attention. The kind of attention truth demands. Afterward, a woman approached me, nervous but smiling. "Miss Brooks," she said softly, "I was here that night, the holiday party." I didn't say anything then. I should have. I smiled back. "You just did." She exhaled, eyes wet, and walked away. And that, more than the headlines, the trials, or the sales, was my real victory. That evening, I returned home to my apartment, overlooking the city. I poured a glass of wine, opened my laptop, and checked my email. There was a message from a university ethics department inviting me to consult on a new leadership program. The subject line read, "Building cultures that don't need whistleblowers." I laughed quietly. Maybe that was the endgame of revenge, to make sure no one else ever needed it. As the skyline shimmered against the dark, I thought about that first line again. Women are so predictable. Maybe we are. We predict outcomes. We read patterns. We see cracks before the collapse. And sometimes, when the world refuses to listen, we don't just predict, we correct. I raised my glass to the city lights, to the silence that used to hurt but now hummed with peace, and whispered to no one in particular. Predict that, Michael. If you felt that justice hit the right place today, make sure to hit that like button. Subscribe to Revenge Files for more real, ruthless, and mind-blowing revenge stories. Because sometimes karma needs a little help. I'm Amelia, and this was another story they'll never forget.